Diplomatic and economic tensions between South Korea and Japan are reaching new highs as Japan forges ahead with its export restrictions against South Korea. Japan's moves, widely seen as an economic retaliation for a decades-old historical issue here in Korea, is now sparking fresh issues regarding Korea-Japan security ties. This while people of Korea continue to boycott Japan, staging large-scale protests condemning the Abe administration. Today, we go in-depth on the worsening relations between the two Asian neighbors and possible ways to resolve the conflict with Dr. Ki-Jeong of Seoul National University's Institute for Japanese Studies. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
So Japan promulgated an amended decree yesterday, officially removing South Korea off its whitelist of trusted trading partners. But it didn't specify the items that will require long procedure of individual export approval. How did you see Japan's announcement yesterday?
That was fully expected from the point of view of the Abe administration. Removing South Korea from the whitelist was well-founded. First, Abe's policy was supported by majority of Japanese people. At first, it had half the support, but at the end of last month, it rose to about 70%. In the upper house election held on July 21st, Abe could also interpret the policy as being supported, as the ruling party won a majority. Furthermore, there was a procedure for receiving public comments after the proposed amendment, and 90% of them supported the decision of Japanese government. So there was no reason to withdraw such a diplomatic-backed policy. Second, the gap between Korea and Japan over the issue of forced labor was still wide. Of course, South Korea had made efforts to settle the problem by sending special envoys and developing parliamentary diplomacy. However, this South Korean response has not satisfied Prime Minister Abe enough to withdraw the decision of excluding South Korea from the whitelist. Though expected, as a researcher of Japanese diplomacy, who have studied in this field for a long time, I see it as a very unusual behavior. Since Abe's emergency, Japan has stressed its diplomacy of claiming. Now, Japan appears to be engaged in diplomacy of acting. This is typical of unilateral diplomacy, just without military force. Such diplomacy is also strange to the Japanese people. That's why the conservative right-wing Japanese people are even more enthusiastic about Prime Minister Abe. However, the liberals in Japan seem to be feeling doubts and apprehensions.
Now, not everyone, though, is siding with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Many in the U.S., as well as some other countries, are voicing concerns over the impact of Japan's trade curbs on South Korea on the global economy. And Abe is also facing some opposition from within Japan. But Abe is forging ahead with his hardline retaliatory stance on South Korea anyway. What are Abe's motives behind his adamant measures?
There are two reasons, I think. One is geopolitics, and the other is history. To get to know Japan's intention, it is worth paying attention to the strategic initiative shared by Prime Minister Abe and his aides in the Prime Minister's office. In particular, the strategic report titled Reconstructing the U.S.-Japan Alliance, published in Japan in September 2017, is important. Here, two conclusions are presented about Japan's relations with South Korea. First, it says that they will not care if the Korea-Japan relationship cools down over historical issues. Second, if South Korea's Moon government approaches to North Korea too rapidly, Japan should check it with the support of the United States. In relation to second conclusion, the Abe administration may have judged that the sudden change on the Korean Peninsula in 2018 has been going beyond the scope Japan was able to control. And indeed, hovering around the stage, Japan tried to intervene and disrupt the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So I think that removing South Korea from the whitelist to regulate exports is the measure for Japan to check and claim a stake in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. But of course, the Supreme Court's ruling of last year is the most direct cause of Japan's provocative actions. Considering this overall, it is all too clear that Japan's actions are aimed at this point. Japan cannot give political reasons to the export restrictions which are still crossing the boundaries of WTO violations. In that case, it is a clear violation of the WTO regulations, so Japan is only trying to deny its connection, but Japan's insinuation lies in the incapacitation of South Korea's Supreme Court ruling.
South Korea also remains firm that it will not back down on Japan's so-called, quote, technology hegemony. It has removed Japan from its own white list of trading partners and is now mulling the termination of Seoul-Tokyo bilateral military information sharing agreement, otherwise called GSOMIA. How do you see our government's countermeasures?
Well, I think Korea's policy of excluding Japan from the whitelist is necessary to convey Korea's position to Japan. Yes, tit for tat is also a strategy which can be adopted as a short-term strategy. It carries a message that if Japan's actions are prolonged, it will also suffer from it. So the move is considered necessary in meaning to prevent Japan from taking further action. In addition, to overcome the current crisis, the Korean government should push for a peace process on the Korean Peninsula more strongly. In this sense, the use of GSOMIA as a card can have unintended consequences apart from its usefulness or morality. Now that Japan has said Korea is not a security ally, of course, it needs to review the need for a military intelligence protection pact based on the trust of its allies. However, it is necessary to wait and see more of Japan's actions by the August 24 deadline, rather than deciding whether to extend the agreement right now. If the Korean side hurriedly brings up the argument of breaking the agreement and turns its position under pressure from the U.S., it could narrow the scope of Seoul's movements.
Now, at the heart of all this, at the heart of Seoul-Tokyo trade tensions, lies the issue of Japan's wartime forced labor compensation. Now, the main sticking point is whether the 1965 Seoul-Tokyo Treaty terminates the individual right of claim. Korea insists that the treaty does not terminate individual right to make claims, while Japan argues that the treaty settled it all. Your take?
Well, Japanese government has never officially denied the individual right to claim. Japan has defended the individual right to claim of the exposed to atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or returnees from the Soviet Union. The Japanese official interpretation of the Korea-Japan Claims Agreement also does not deny the individual right to claim, as it is inevitable to maintain this judgment and consistency. Still, the interpretation of the Japanese judiciary is that the individual has the right to claim but not the right of action in a court. In other words, there is an entrance, but there is no exit. But this is sophistry, which in turn is the same as denying the right to claim. However, the essence of the South Korea Supreme Court's ruling is that it deals with the reparation issue beyond the claim issue. In other words, the content of the ruling is that the colonial rule was illegal, and the victims of forced labor are the victims of basic human rights, and they should be given reparation. No reparation issue has been dealt with in the 1965 treaty or agreement. This is because they failed to reach a clear agreement on the illegality of colonial rule. In this sense, Japan's criticism of the Supreme Court ruling as a violation of Article 2 of the agreement and thus violation of international law is a kind of irrelevant conclusion.
A very delicate and complex issue the two neighbors are facing. But could there be any viable solution to resolve the decades-old historical dispute?
Japan's request is to treat what happened outside the agreement on properties and claims as an issue of the agreement. Rather, Seoul needs to raise the fact that these events are due to discrepancies in interpreting the basic treaty and the agreement, and call on Tokyo to initiate consultations to reach a new interpretation on which the two countries can agree. It's hard work, but it's not impossible, I think. This is because there had been efforts to overcome the limitations of the 1965 regime. The two countries need to recognize such efforts. Those achievements include the 1993 Kono Statement, 1995 Murayama Statement, 1998 Korea-Japan Joint Declaration, and 2010 Kannauto Statement. Through these statements and declaration, Japan's perception of its colonial rule has progressed little by little. As a result, Naoto Kan's 2010 statement contained the perception that Japan's colonial rule was against the will of the Korean people. This perception can be interpreted as a reference to the illegality of colonial rule. It is now time to include this perception in the joint declaration between South Korea and Japan. In this way, by harmonizing the perception of colonial rule, we can stabilize the foundation of Korea-Japan relations, which have always been shaken over historical issues. However, the problem is the obligation of reparations arising from Japanese recognition of the illegality of colonial rule. In this regard, the Korean government needs to be encouraged. It can recognize all financial actions the Japanese government has taken as de facto reparations and promise that it will not demand any further compensation or reparation. This is the same way as the reparation issue is settled in Sino-Japanese relations. China has decided to take the right to claim reparation, but does not exercise it. Since then, the conditions for reconciliation have been created between the Chinese individual victims and the Japanese companies. If Japan acknowledges the illegality of the colonial rule and South Korea regards the past financial actions of Japan as de facto reparations, I believe that the problem can be solved in the same way as Sino-Japan reconciliation.
So Japan's recognition on the illegality of its colonial rule over Korea appears to be the key, could be the key in resolving the historical issues. Thank you so much,
Yes,
Dr. Nam, for your insights tonight.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching.